transitioning music goes on. For those of you that don't know me, I am Dale. My wife and I, Judy, who's sitting up here and was serving you food earlier. We've been part of North City for about a year now, and so it's been a joy to be part of a dinner church community. It's been good for us. So we asked you the question around getting away. Do you ever get away to remote places, to places that you're kind of really unplugged and away from everything? So I want to do a little survey. How many of you would love to unplug by going to the mountains? How many of you are mountain people? Yeah, mountain people. I'm a mountain person too. I'll tell you that in a second. How many of you are like, give me the Boundary Waters, National Park, that kind of wilderness, like getaway? Yes, a few of you like that. Okay. I should have told you the three choices first, but you can vote for multiple ones here apparently now because I didn't do that. So now here's your third choice. How many of you would love to travel to see some of the most famous gardens in the world? Like there's some really famous gardens in the world in Europe and other places. So a few of you got that. Did I cover everybody then? Hopefully maybe out of those three. And if you want to do all three, that's okay too. The beach. I wasn't going to give you the beach option because there's a reason for that, and we'll get to that in a minute. So I'm a mountain person. My happy place is the mountains. In particular, I love the Rocky Mountains. I love Colorado. I love also the Canadian Rockies. Breckenridge, Colorado is a favorite place for my wife and I. About every other year we get away there. This is the year we're supposed to be going there, but we have a son who's getting married and we're helping financially and it's going to take a lot of time. So not bitter or anything, but I'm not getting to the mountains this year. We also love the Canadian Rockies. If you ever get a chance to go to Banff in Canada, is one of the most gorgeous places on earth. And so for me, the mountains are that kind of place, getting away and unplugging and those kinds of things. I asked you those three choices around mountains and gardens and wilderness, because in our Jesus story today, we're going to notice Jesus loved to get away and to get away to remote places, and he loved all three of them. So if you raised your hand for all three, you're really a lot like Jesus probably. So our Jesus story today is going to be a couple of stories in a sense, but the primary story comes to us in the book of Luke. Luke was not an eyewitness of Jesus. He was a physician who traveled and became a follower of Jesus after Jesus returned to heaven. And so he decided he wanted to write a biography about Jesus, but he couldn't do that from his own memory, so he instead interviewed people. And so his biography of Jesus, we call it the Gospel of Luke, tells all of these stories about Jesus. And of course, he had to interview all of these people. And one of the things that he really was fascinated by, Dr. Luke was a physician, was the way in which Jesus consistently and constantly withdrew. And so he's going to tell you a lot of times in his story about Jesus withdrawing, and he actually tells you the stories of Jesus withdrawing to all three of these type of places. The first time we encounter it in the book of Luke is Jesus is about to begin his public ministry, so he hasn't really done anything yet in terms of what we would think of as making him famous, like teaching and doing miracles and all of those kinds of things. But before Jesus begins his public ministry, if I can hold my page down here, in Luke chapter 4, Dr. Luke tells us, what? The clip. No, I think I got to switch pages. So if I stand this way, okay. Jeepers, really? Okay. It does say this, I promise. Oh, there were my glasses, everything. Thank you, Kara.
Want me to help you hold it?
I might. I don't know.
Here.
Okay. Thank you. Kara is so... Everybody get Kara a hand. Thank you. And then I need my glasses. All right. In Luke chapter 4, it says, "Then Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan River." He had just been baptized by his cousin John. And then listen to this. "He was led by the Spirit to go into the wilderness for 40 days. Okay, thank you, Kara. So this is going to tell a story, and I'm not going to go into the whole story, but what I wanted to draw out was this picture of Jesus being led by the Spirit into the wilderness. Now, in first century Palestine, there was on the very western coast of Palestine is the Mediterranean Sea. So if you think of the Mediterranean Sea, see, I got to think about how you guys think about, that on this side, and then there's Palestine. On the other side, there's a lake up at the top called the Sea of Galilee, and then there's a river called the Jordan River, and then it flows into the Dead Sea. So there's this patch of land between these two water masses. But everything to the east of the Jordan River starts to turn into desert. And it gradually does so, and it becomes wilderness first, so it's kind of, you can go out there and you can hang out there and you will live. But then if you go farther east, and really far east, you might die because it turns into desert, and if you don't have any water, you can only last about 2 days. But Jesus, it said, was led by the Spirit from the Jordan River to the east to go out into the wilderness. And so Jesus is intentionally, by God, led into this space before he begins his public ministry. And Luke is fascinated by this, and he is fascinated by Jesus doing this. And he'll tell you over and over and over again in his gospel that Jesus did this. So he begins by telling you when Jesus starts his public ministry, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days. That's a long time. And in that space, he's alone, so he practices solitude. In that place, he can't talk to other humans, so he practices silence. And then in that space, he really can't do anything productive like he normally does, like teaching and doing miracles and things. So he's going to also practice stillness. And I like to think of those 3 S's: silence, solitude, and stillness. And Jesus practiced this for 40 days, and then this became a habit for him. And as I said, Dr. Luke is fascinated by this. Let me just give you a few examples, and notice that it's not just wilderness, but other places too. Jesus, he tells you all of these stories of all these healings that he's doing, and then all of a sudden he interrupts these stories one after another, and he says, early the next morning, Jesus went out into the wilderness. So he's healing and teaching, and all of a sudden, boom, Luke is fascinated because Jesus would interrupt his times and he'd go into the wilderness. Luke has 5 summary statements in his gospel, and the first one is this in chapter 5, and he says, vast crowds came to hear Jesus preach and to see him, or be healed by him. But Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. So here's this summary statement. Jesus could be on and work really hard, but then he also could be off. And he could withdraw. And he could go into this wilderness area where he had to practice being alone, solitude. He had to practice being silent, didn't have anyone else to talk to. And he had to also practice stillness. He really couldn't do anything in that place. A couple more examples. Here we encounter Jesus not going to the wilderness, but also to the mountains. Jesus loved the mountains. One day, soon after, Jesus went to a mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night. So Luke just keeps interrupting his biography of Jesus with these examples of Jesus withdrawing, sometimes to the wilderness, sometimes to a mountain to be alone and be with God. And later on he says, one day as Jesus was alone praying, so he's like, oh yeah, here's a story, and Jesus is alone praying. Another time he says, about 8 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him onto the mountain where they could pray. And of course, Jesus also loved gardens, because we know that Jesus had a very favorite garden called the Garden of Gethsemane. And this was, you get double duty with the Garden of Gethsemane because it's also on the Mount of Olives. So when Jesus would go to the garden, he'd also go to the mountain. So it's kind of like double dipping, you know, it's like a double cone. And he would withdraw to the Garden of Gethsemane. And you may remember that the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took his disciples with him to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, because there was something about being in a garden for Jesus. And so here's the thing that I want you to think about for a moment, is do you have a pattern of being able to be on, but also be off? And when you're off, are you comfortable, like Jesus, being a person who can be alone, a person who can be silent, and a person who can be still? When I was in my mid-30s, I was in my second kind of job. I had gone and gotten a master's, and then got my first job, and then I kind of advanced and got a second job, and I was in my kind of early to mid-30s, and I was working away, and I thought, you know, the harder I worked, the more I could get done, and I was kind of determined to be the best that I could at my job, and I threw myself into my job, and I was working, and I burned out. And I ended up in a season of 18 months where I had to step out of the work that I was doing and do some other work just to kind of survive and to recover. And for 18 months, I was kind of doing this other work. And while I was doing this other work, for the first time, I began to notice in the story of Jesus this example of Jesus being able to be on, but also be off. And I noticed in this example of Jesus that he was a person who was comfortable with being alone and silent and still. And to be honest with you, I had no pattern of doing that in my life. I had to have some people come alongside of me and help me develop that pattern and to learn how to be comfortable connecting with God on my own and in silence and in stillness. And for me, that third S, stillness, is probably the hardest one for me. I'm an introvert. Some of you may be extroverts. And so if you're an introvert, it's a little bit easier to be alone than maybe if you're an extrovert. Maybe if you're an extrovert, being alone is really hard. And if you're a person who is, an introvert, you're probably a little more comfortable being, in a place where you're not talking to people. So it's like not that hard. But stillness, oh my, that was really hard for me. To really be in places and times where I gave God myself apart from what I was doing. And to offer God this offering of of being with God apart from my work. And so I had to start really small. So like 15 minutes a day. Right? It was like, okay, maybe for 15 minutes I can sit or I can take a walk and I can not be working or thinking about work or doing something, and I can just be with God. And that became a small thing that I learned, that I began to develop into a pattern where now once a year I spend 2 full days with a friend of mine, Glenn. We go at the end of July and we go to a Roman Catholic retreat center and we spend 2 full days. Each day we spend the entire day alone and still and silent for like a whole day. I learned how to do that, right? And then in the evening, because I can't go 2 full days of it, we come together in the evening and we talk and process what we hear God talking to us about. And so today in our Jesus story, we see this example of Jesus being able to be on and give his best, but also be off. And do you have that kind of pattern? And this summer we're doing kind of experiments from the life of Jesus, things that Jesus was doing that we're going to try these out. And so my invitation to you is to talk at your tables. What would be a realistic thing for you in terms of trying to start building this kind of pattern in your life? Some of you are parents with young children, and like this is a crazy scene of life. Like, I mean, try to imagine maybe finding 15 minutes might seem like almost impossible. But maybe with your spouse or with some parents or something, you could like, okay, once a week I'm going to try to find like 15 minutes or a half hour where I can just be still and silent and alone with God. Because there's some ways in which we connect with God that are unique when we're in those kind of spaces. So what would be realistic for you? Maybe you already have this pattern in your life and you could share that. But what would be a realistic way for you to start to build this pattern of being on, but also being off? And so talk at your tables a little bit about that. What kind of jumps out for you from the example of Jesus, and what would maybe be realistic for you as you think about it? Ready, set, go. All right, I hope you've had a chance to process a little bit at your tables. We were at our table talking a little bit about how important it is to interrupt our lives and how we experience God when we intentionally interrupt our lives. And there's something about that, isn't it? Jesus interrupted his kind of routine, didn't he? And then we were talking and sharing about different places we've experienced God in nature. And there's something about nature, isn't there? But then we were also just noticing when you do interrupt your life and you make yourself available to God, wherever you're at, you can experience God. And that little moment of silence and solitude and stillness, even if it's just for a couple of minutes, wherever you're at. And there's something about turning our phones off, isn't it? It's something about turning the TV off, something about saying no to those things that puts us in a place to hear God and sense God's presence with us. So, well, it's great to be together tonight, and thanks for being here. I want to send us out into the week with a blessing, and if you feel comfortable to kind of hold your hands open to receive this blessing, please do so. As you go through this week, may you have eyes to see God in everything that you're doing. As you go through this week, even in the busy times, may you hear God with you in whatever you're doing. And as you go through this week, as you pause, maybe it's just for a moment of silence, a moment of solitude, a moment of stillness, may you feel God's presence with you. And in all of it, may you know that you are not alone. Amen. Have a great week. Hope to see you back next week.